Welcome everybody to the third annual Faculty Colloquium series sponsored by the Provost's Office. Our first presentation will be by Dr. Lolly Bargerstock, Professor of Social Work and Social Work Program Director. She received her Master's of Social Work from Indiana University. She completed her PhD at Western Michigan University with a research focus on professional and religious identity integration among undergraduate social work students. She has practiced social work in the fields of mental health, aging, hospice, and home health care. Before she began her full-time teaching tenure, she provided mental health services for AU students and taught as an adjunct faculty member. Dr. Bargerstock primarily teaches macro-level social work classes, helping students understand the positive impact they can have on communities and organizations. Today, Dr. Bargerstock will be talking about integration of professional identity and religious identity in social work undergraduates. Dr. Bargerstock.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My reasoning for being interested in this research topic was that I have observed some of our own social work students struggle with bringing together a professional identity and their own religious beliefs or identity. Because I have a lot of material, I'm going to stick to a script and probably somewhat speed talk. So I apologize for that. But as you know, trying to bring down, this was my dissertation work at Western Michigan University, and trying to streamline it down into a 20 to 25 minute presentation was pretty challenging. So let's start with some key concepts. In social work literature, professional identity is defined as one's sense of belonging to a profession, coupled with a commitment to enact the skills, beliefs, values, etc. of that profession. Professional identity is important to the young adult as it provides a vision of their future occupational role and status in society. It's also important for providing ethical and effective services. In regard to religious identity, it's helpful to differentiate it from a couple of different terms found in literature. One is religious affiliation, which is an alignment with a religious group that may or may not be internalized and practiced. Another term, religiosity, is often used interchangeably with religious identity in literature, but it's often measured in tangible practices such as church attendance, prayer, that sort of thing. And it doesn't necessarily speak to self-concept, which I was interested in. So for purposes of this research, I used Seldek's definition, the extent to which one holds the belief system, values, and practices of a religion as central to self-concept and decision-making. In regard to identity integration, contemporary identity theory focuses on social psychological approaches, which emphasize identity as being formed in social groups. These approaches view identity as an ongoing process rather than something that's an achieved status. In addition, these theories recognize people as possessing multiple social identities. So identity integration then is the management of multiple identities into an integrated, cohesive sense of self. The Council on Social Work Education, which is our accrediting organization, states that we need to graduate students who identify with the profession. Social work programs have primarily and traditionally attempted to instill professional ideals through a role acquisition approach. We teach students what values and ethical standards are a part of the profession, and then we expect them to act in accordance with those. Internalization of the values, or integration with one's personal values, is not addressed in this approach. It's assumed the student will simply accept these. Haynes, as well as Cole and Reuter, argue that acting is insufficient for professional identity. Instead, the ideals must be internalized in a way that the professional identity becomes part of the personal identity. The other problem with the role acquisition approach is that it really only works when the instructor and the student hold very similar worldviews. So exploring the integration of professional identity and Christian religious identity in social work students is important because there is a difference in worldviews. The contemporary predominant social work worldview leans toward humanism, postmodernism, and inclusivity. Some people enter social work education, however, with a primarily religious worldview that holds there is one truth that transcends human limitation, that is, in a sense, truer than secular beliefs or the precepts of other religions, and provides an exclusive path to an afterlife. Tension between these two worldviews has been evident in social work literature, with Judeo-Christian orthodoxy particularly being noted as a point of contention. So this is one of the reasons I chose to focus specifically on Christian social work students and not include other religions in my study. Of course, this point of contention brings forth different concerns for the profession than it does for the student who claims Christianity. For instance, from the professional perspective, client protection is paramount, and the concern exists that students who perceive their religion as life-saving may feel compelled to impose it or impose their views on their vulnerable clients. Meanwhile, student concerns may focus on their own protection, particularly their ability to abide by their conscience in professional settings. So, for instance, they may ask, will I be expected to provide referrals for abortion services if that is not something that I believe in through my conscience? Because the profession's most distinctive feature is a commitment to engage in political advocacy on behalf of marginalized populations, another potential concern is that a student's religious views may jeopardize his or her willingness to advocate on behalf of those marginalized views if they believe that population is sinning. So an example of that would be advocating for marriage rights for same-sex couples. On the other hand, some students perceive themselves as being part of a marginalized group within a profession that aims to advocate on behalf of marginalized groups. A final related issue for the profession is that students acting outside of the professional code of ethics places the profession at risk. While a sense of dissonance between identity as a social worker and identity as a Christian may leave the student feeling at risk emotionally, as well as even in the ability to find jobs in which they feel like they will be able, that will be compatible. A search of social work literature found 13 professional identity studies that used students and not social workers as participants, and 3 major themes came out of that literature. I'm focusing on the kind of darker orange bubble there of integration of personal and professional spheres. There were 6 studies found that related to that, and they reported the following findings. Personal experience or worldview is often cited as motivation for joining the profession. Some students feel a strong sense of fit and even refer to it as their calling. Some students do experience identity dissonance, which negatively impacted mental health and academic achievement. In the 3 studies that reported that dissonance, religious beliefs were named as one of the things that presented conflict for them between the 2 identities. Students employ a variety of strategies to manage the dissonance, and when push comes to shove in the prior literature, students chose personal identity over professional identity. So this brought me to the following research questions. I wanted to know basically how students with a strong religious identity experienced professional identity formation, and then along with that, if they experienced conflict between those 2 identities, how did they actually manage that? I recruited from 5 public universities, from which I actually got participants from 3 of those public universities. I deemed age as an inclusion criteria because various identity theories pose that young adulthood is both a significant and vulnerable time period for identity formation. Along with identifying as Christian, participants needed to answer yes to the question, do you consider your religion or faith to be a central part of your life? This question was intended to weed out students who might identify as Christian, but not actively practice faith or deem it as all that important in their life. I then conducted, once I had students that fit that inclusion criteria, I conducted semi-structured narrative interviews with them. And I kind of modeled those or organized those interviews into 3 segments: a segment about professional identity, a segment about religious identity, and then a segment of questions that were related to managing those 2 identities. This slide shows you the participant demographics. I had 9 students who participated in the study, 7 females, 2 males. that percentage of males is actually higher than what the percentage of males are in social work education programs throughout the United States. I also, within this, had 3 students who self-identified as Black, and so that also would be a higher percentage than what you would find in social work education programs. And then you can see that there's also some diversity, although they all claimed Christianity, they came from kind of varying backgrounds. As I listened to students' narratives of becoming a social worker, a common storyline with 6 primary components emerged. First, students reported recognizing themselves as helpers at a fairly young age, usually in family, school, or church. Viewing the self as a helper understandably led to the pursuit of a helping profession with which they were familiar: teaching, nursing, ministry, not social work. 7 of the 9 started out in a major other than social work, but they discovered the familiar profession did not fit. So I think of the education major who said, I realized I don't want to teach kids how to do math. I want to make sure that they have food at home so that when they get to school, they're not hungry and they can learn that math from someone else. Once they did decide to enter into social work classes, students generally felt a strong fit with the profession and had various ways in which they believed that fit was confirmed by others, by their own emotional sense of fit, and by divine affirmation. Despite this sense of fit, challenges generally emerged as students revealed their professional plans to others and as they became more knowledgeable about the profession itself. At this point, storylines became much less linear and more fluid, with participants moving back and forth between seeing their fit with social work, having challenges to that fit, attempting to resolve the fit, and then reshaping how they view the profession and themselves within it. Students reported 2 primary categories of challenge to the professional identity: receiving negative messages from other people and their own self-doubt. As you can see here, the most common negative messages were that they would not be paid well and that it would be too emotional for them. Now, I'll stand a little bit on the soapbox and say I would appreciate it if you would not present that image to students, because many students do feel this as a calling, just as people feel called to ministry. And so students in this study felt discouraged away from it at times. But then they also dealt with some of their own self-doubt. And I thought it was interesting that the most commonly mentioned self-doubt was that I might not be able to put my personal biases aside in order to effectively work with clients. I was surprised then as well that not only did this professional identity storyline develop, but there was a common religious identity storyline that also developed. Here we see the primary components of that storyline. The first 4 components of the path generally were told in chronological order, based off of a simple interview prompt: tell me about your faith background. All students but 1 began the story by talking about family relationship to religion when they were a child. 4 participants did report growing up in the church. The other 4 who referenced family as a starting point were also introduced to religion by parents. A significant difference in their storyline, however, was that that involvement became disrupted due to some sort of family disruption, divorce, death, or financial circumstances. The second component of the religious identity storyline related to motivation. Since the majority of study participants have been introduced to religion in the family, they often referenced familial expectations as the guiding force for religious involvement as a child. 5 participants specifically referenced Christianity in their childhood as an obligation or expectation. The third common plot component was a period of questioning religious beliefs. Questioning religious beliefs became a way of leaving the somewhat naive and uncritical religious identity of childhood behind. Questioning appeared to be an inciting force in the religious identity storyline. All participants in the study pointed to a period of questioning, although this period was described with varying intensity and spiritual significance. Having questioned previously held religious beliefs allowed participants to move into the next part of the storyline. Having recounted ways in which their faith and religious identity had been challenged, participants often then noted that they were now in charge of their own religious life. They were no longer children who went to church out of obligation, and they were very proud of this. Owning one's religious identity was not the end of the story. In the last component, entitled Keep Learning, Participants tended to view themselves as lifelong learners that would always be gaining new understanding of what it means to be a Christian. Similar to the repetitive process in professional identity development, the young adults cycled back and forth between questioning in response to life situations, owning their questions and answers as part of a belief system, and then opening themselves to further learning opportunities. So then I had students talk about these two identities and how they perceived them as fitting or not fitting. These were the questions that I utilized, the primary questions that I utilized in the interview process. Tell me about your experience of being both. Tell me how they seem to fit. Tell me how they don't fit, and if they don't fit, how you manage that. And then how do you see yourself 10 years from now being both a practicing social worker and a Christian? Here we have the points of fit reported by students. Students generally viewed social work and Christianity as being highly compatible. Here you can see the specific overlap mentioned by students. And I'll just highlight one of those, choice or free will. There were several students who talked about in social work, we emphasize the client's right to self-determination, and they saw a similarity with the concept of free will within Christianity. Jenna said, choices are, and excuse the student speak, choices are like, that's a huge thing about like the Christian faith that I'm thankful for and that I've learned is that there's always a choice, whether it's the right choice or the wrong choice. But I'm just learning that there's definitely a choice in social work. Participants in this research study also reported experiencing tension as complex social issues were discussed in the classroom. The figure on this slide displays a visual representation of common hot topics for tension, the social context of that tension, and internal manifestations of the tension. The outside edge of the arc represents various social contexts for the provocation of tension. These social contexts provided opportunity for both external and internal conflict. Externally, participants sometimes engaged in defense of either their social work perspective or their Christian perspective. Internally, they were challenged to reconcile what seemed like competing beliefs and to fend off negative characterizations heard about Christians or social workers. The phrase social work peers is bolded because it was reported most frequently as being a significant social context for experiencing tension. Contentious discourse was typically reported to have taken place in the classroom within guided discussion. Even though the tension was prompted by discussion of the topic areas, students consistently identified the manner in which classmates argued as the cause of the felt tension. So it wasn't the topic, it was how their peers went about discussing it with them. Anne and Bertha described the heated classroom debate in these two ways, which I'll let you look at. In regard to social work faculty, students generally portrayed faculty as sensitive to religious beliefs, although not proactive enough in encouraging respectful debate. I want to stress that the students in this study did not express being uncomfortable with the ideas that they were hearing. Their discomfort came from the way they perceived Christians as being portrayed by non-Christian students. In the midst of, or the internal tension that they experienced then seemed to revolve around relationship, with students asking themselves these primary questions. With this tension, how do I stay true to myself? How do I stay in good relationship with people I value personally? Because some of that social context was conflict with family, for instance, regarding differing beliefs. And how will I establish and maintain good professional relationships? I want to go back for a minute again to this slide to just then show you that the figure displays these relationship concerns as situated between the internal processing, the dual identity, of beliefs related to identity and the external social context in which participants experienced both support and tension. As social work students experienced conflict between these two identities, they were not only evaluating who they believed themselves to be, but they were also evaluating how others perceived them and what that perception meant to their relationship and ultimately their identity. So both the internal tension and the external conflict were managed with a variety of methods, which are shown on this particular slide. Some methods weren't necessarily conscious when employed, but students could look back at those methods and see how they coped using a method such as a positive reframe, like, this tension is really good for me because it's helped me figure out what I really believe. And then some methods were intentional, such as a student who suggested she used the contentious classroom experience to practice calmly responding to someone who seemed angry, as she might have to do in the future with clients. Or you see here, one of the intentional actions was to stay hidden. There were students who hid their Christianity from peers because as a way of managing the conflict. I want to illustrate two methods that were particularly interesting in light of identity integration, and the first one is bridge. This was a method in which they connected ideas or people. Basically, they attempted to bring Christianity and social work together by moving back and forth between the ideas and the people associated with each of them. So for Jenna, being an ambassador to each group meant she would represent each identity positively in the face of negative perception. The role of ambassador provided a more pleasant portrait of Christians to social workers and likely of social workers to Christians. This bridge role also supported integration of Jenna's religious and professional identities. Another one that's not on the slide was reflect. Self-reflection was noted as a method for understanding oneself and responding effectively in the midst of classroom tension. Kendall stated, there was one time last semester where I finally had to say something in class just because. In those situations too, I think you have to be prayerful because there's only going to be certain times where I think it's worth saying anything. I've always tried to be really prayerful in class when I feel like I need to speak up in making sure that, when I need to speak up or making sure that my emotions are on track, that I'm not speaking out of anger. In this example, we hear a blending of social work reflection, making sure my emotions are on track, and religious reflection, be really prayerful in class, that enabled Kendall to proceed with verbalizing her thoughts in an intimidating situation. So the findings of this study are supported by previous research in the ways that you see on this current slide. However, it did differ from some of the previous studies. One difference was that students did not cite their religion as having been a motivating force for choosing social work. They did, however, believe that their place in social work was divinely planned or inspired. As the student who took on the name John Paul said, God plopped me here. This belief served to bolster commitment to the profession when they faced various challenges to that professional identity. Also differing from previous findings, students in the current study did not clearly show a preference for personal values or identity. Rather, they displayed a commitment to placing clients' interest before their own. Goffman's model of stigma management seems relevant to this study. The word stigma figuratively means a mark of disgrace and typically refers to a negative characteristic. Goffman suggested that people who are stigmatized interact with others in a manner intended to reduce impact of the stigma. These behaviors were displayed by participants in the current study as they looked for cues in both faculty and other students as to whether they were Christian, open to hearing a Christian perspective, or in fact possibly hostile to hearing a Christian perspective. Participants then made decisions about revealing their religious identity based on interpretation of those cues. Several participants actively attempted to discredit negative stereotypes of Christians through modeling behavior that did not fit with the stereotype and reported having been told that they were, quote, not like other Christians, end quote. Efforts to portray oneself differently from the stereotypical Christian or attempts to downplay or hide identity as a Christian can be viewed as a type of covering. These efforts serve to minimize conflict while also allowing the student to maintain a stable, if somewhat superficial, relationship with others in the social work. So going back to what it means to develop a professional question, or a professional identity, I leave you with this question. Do we want students to cover themselves in order to make it through their undergraduate experience? Thank you.